Empty worlds. You might think that it's counterintuitive to fill a game world with, well, nothing. But plenty of games do it. Fuel, a game released in 2009, is now almost solely remembered because of its world. To clarify, there's nothing to actually find in it. All the people, animals, signs of life, that's all gone. The only thing we're left with is an absurdly large and empty map, 14,400 square kilometers in size, bigger than about 75 countries on Earth. Now, the game doesn't really have objectives, or goals, or side missions, or even a direction. It does have a couple of races where the AI is hilariously incompetent, so it's super easy for the player to win. But the point of the game is almost implicit: to just explore. The landscape of the game is admittedly quite intriguing, with rolling hills, snow-capped mountains, and vast arid deserts. It's been described as a Mad Max-style post-apocalyptic world. Despite the unequivocal fact that there is nothing to be found except the occasional ruins and the very copy-paste assets that litter the world, you can find a host of videos online of people crossing and exploring the map, for no other apparent reason than just to say, I did it. I personally remember watching Nerd Cubed go on a road trip in Fuel about 8 years ago, where it took him a little over 2 hours to complete it. As a kid, I was always far more interested in open world games than anything else, to the point where if it wasn't open world, I just basically wouldn't play it. Just Cause 2 is a pretty prime example of what you could call an anti-empty world. The map size is about 14 times smaller than Fuel, but that might be misleading, because it's still absolutely enormous. I used to simply drive around finding small towns and settlements. Something about that was magical to the 11-year-old me, to the point where I actually made an hour-long video of me simply doing a road trip across the map. Unfortunately, it was immediately taken down due to having copyrighted music, so my first video only exists in a Google Vault somewhere. Most games have, if not empty worlds, then at least large empty spaces that complement or at least serve as liminal spaces between the real attention-grabbing areas. Of course, for every person who loves trudging through forests or valleys to find our next objective, there are people who equally would rather fast travel. I can't help but feel, though, that when you fast travel and skip the paths, the forests, the small nooks and crannies of a world, you miss out on something. Something about the context of the world, the people in it, is lost. The concept of fast traveling isn't new. It dates back to at least 1986 with the title Dragon Quest. Though looking at the graphics and gameplay experience, you can see why it wouldn't necessarily be a great time to have to travel through it. With newer titles, however, the entire world is filled with elements, chance encounters, fascinating areas, settlements, and in a real sense, the entire feel of the game. However, this video isn't about worlds filled with interesting things, it's about empty worlds, so let's get back on topic. There's a paradox at play here. Worlds that unequivocally have virtually nothing in them don't always feel empty, and worlds that really attempt to feel alive can sometimes feel the complete opposite. Need for Speed Heat was initially panned by the critics for having a world that felt extremely lonely. Despite the AI cars, highly decorated and detailed maps, there was simply an emptiness that was hard to ignore. You didn't feel like just one of a million cars driving around a bustling city. You felt alone, in a cold robotic void, a facade of life. And yet, why then did the Aurora Wager feel so good? I'm getting ahead of myself. The Aurora Wager was a game developed in only 7 days back in 2013. The entire concept of the game is that you have to make it to the North Pole, whilst hopping between islands to collect equipment and riding wind pockets to head north. As far as you can see, there is only a dense layer of fog, from which the occasional hilltop pokes out. The only stuff to be found on these islands is fuel, a compass maybe, just general equipment to fit your balloon with. There is an extremely strong sense of loneliness which prevails throughout the entire game, however. The desolate peaks stretching as far as the eye can see, floating alone through the sky. And yet, somehow the world feels more full, more immersive than Need for Speed Heat, at least personally. It seems that the very emptiness itself is what creates the extremely strong ambience present throughout the journey, which makes it feel more full. Empty worlds, done right, feel more full. If I actively tried to describe the feeling of making your way through a barren wasteland, accompanied only by the howling wind and the soft, melancholy soundtrack, I'm not sure I could. But if you know the kind of vibe I'm talking about, then you know how strong, how immersive, how full it feels. And by contrast, how empty a facade of a bustling living world is when you peel back the surface level to find nothing at all. The first game I played with what I would consider to be a seriously empty world would be Simple Planes. A pretty simple mobile game that I downloaded on my iPad in 2015. The entire world is essentially a few low-poly islands surrounded by endless oceans. Of course, crucially, the point of this game is to build planes, not to explore the world, but it almost seems to defeat the fun of flying in whatever monstrosity my 12-year-old self came up with, if you can't fly around in an area that looks, at least nice. I must have spent countless hours charting out maps between the islands and making short journeys out into the sea to find nothing. I knew there was nothing. There was no question about that. But for whatever reason, that seems to have done nothing to reduce the urge to do it nonetheless. I virtually never committed to the journeys, however. There was something that even in this indie, fairly graphically poor and not very immersive game, that made me turn back just before the land got out of sight. The idea of running out of fuel in this oceanic void was horrifying. Exploration seems to be a baked-in desire to virtually all humans, for whatever reason. But the fabric of what it means to explore starts to break down when we're not just talking about empty worlds, but infinite empty worlds. Games like No Man's Sky and Minecraft have famously delved into infinite procedurally generated worlds. And yes, I know that technically neither are infinite, but unless you plan on playing 24/7 for 500 years on end to reach the Minecraft world border, then they're effectively infinite. Both do have life, but the life is simple. They're side characters. Nothing compared to the complex, multifaceted personality of the protagonist. They're empty in the sense that they're empty of anything like you. And they're also empty in the sense that the game doesn't tell you what you have to do, or what is the objective. The moment they do, suddenly the world ceases to be empty, and the vast expanses between points simply become liminal spaces between the areas that actually matter. Once the objectives are removed, who decides which areas are relevant and which aren't? Does it make each area of the map in an infinite empty world infinitely valuable or infinitely worthless? My fascination with these fake endless worlds somewhat faded after 2016. I got a laptop, then a PC, and I could play more mainstream games with objectives and missions, and the world simply became a backdrop again. But recently, in my Steam library, I saw a title that I'd barely thought about since the last 7 years. What the hell? After all this time away from this world, where I'd spent hundreds of hours of it as a kid, I finally came back. It looked exactly the same. Still bland, badly rendered, and empty. But this time, even more aware that past the few main islands there was nothing to find, I decided to venture out, as far as I could. There's an important distinction to make here. We humans often deeply enjoy exploring and roaming around abandoned or long-forgotten places, because at least they're interesting. You'll see a thing, whatever that may be. A rusted out car, an old path, even a single screw on an old rotten window frame. Video game worlds are fundamentally different because there is no question of seeing a thing on my voyage. There will be nothing. I will see nothing. There is no question. Why doesn't this stop the urge to do it anyway? First, of course, I need to design a plane. Opting to build around an engine, I did a bit of research and settled on the Lycoming 0320, which was the most fuel-efficient engine I could find, and set about building an aircraft around it. I'd need the highest speed I could get, and the most fuel I can pack in for a long, final journey into the void. First, I made the basic shape of the fuselage, trying to keep the weight as low as possible to improve speed and range. The cockpit was to seat 2 people who are gonna have a one-way trip into the void. Keeping a pretty standard wing shape with a fairly long aspect ratio to try and increase lift, I put 3 engines, as they only have about 150 horsepower each, and I want my speed as well as fuel efficiency. Finally, I can put 2 large fuel tanks in the aircraft, one in the nose containing 80 liters, and a huge one behind the pilots holding 1,400 liters. Changing my mind at the last minute, I moved the wings to the back for a bit of an experimental design, and honestly, just because it looks cool. Here we are, on the airfield. I put a simple cockpit together just to keep track of my speed and fuel. And here we go. Let's start up the engines. One's going on. Switch on 2. And 3. And I guess we're about ready to go. And liftoff. And we're on our way. As the airfield gets further away, we climb to around 15,000 feet and head due north. The terrain below is full of mountains and valleys and the occasional lake. I calculate that I have about enough fuel for 9.5 hours of flight, which means this is going to be a very long journey. As the sun goes down, we get a beautiful sunset that lasts what feels like not long enough, before the world is engulfed in darkness and I can see virtually nothing. Only the faint glow of the dials in the cockpit keep me company. Four hours in. By this time, the sun is slowly starting to rise again. Any sign of land is completely gone. We must have passed the coast during the night. Now we find ourselves hundreds of miles into the ocean, and we've got about half a tank of gas left. The unnatural stillness of the oceans and simple plains only serves to emphasize the emptiness of the world we now find ourselves in. And yet, even here, truly in the middle of nowhere, we find a tiny desert island, hundreds of miles from any land. Why this is here, I genuinely have no idea. I might be the first person to ever find this. It serves almost like a milestone to show how far we've come. It's nice, in a weird way, that even out here, there's something rather than nothing. Nevertheless, we press on, the small patch of land getting smaller and smaller until it's barely visible. This will be the last land we see. Seven hours in, the weather's taken a turn for the worst, and I had to lose a bit of altitude to avoid the really strong winds higher up. It's about midday, so it's only going to get darker from here. 8 hours in, the sun's going down again, and we're down to about 10% of fuel left. One thing I can do is turn off the front engine and leave just the 2 wing engines continue running to try and save fuel. Why? I don't know. It's just delaying the inevitable, keeping me up in the warm cockpit and away from the cold, endless ocean for just a few more minutes. Nine hours in, I'm running on empty. The last drops of gas are being fed into the engines. We're running on fumes. Finally, with a cough and a splutter, they give out, and suddenly it feels so quiet. I take the aircraft down, losing speed for a water landing. With some final adjustments and the water looming ever closer, the aircraft makes contact. From the moment I took off, I knew how it was going to end. I did it anyway. Something that people will sometimes forget is that games' worlds are never viewed in a vacuum. Your entire life experience, your thoughts, your vibes, your connotations, ultimately mean that you look at the game through the lens of who you are. An empty world is just a blank canvas. You might not want a black canvas, and that's fine. You might want to find yourself deep in a bustling space station surrounded by hundreds of fully simulated NPCs. But conversely, few games have really captured that feeling of isolation, of beautiful loneliness, as you traverse a world that feels untouched. The deep urge to explore, to find new places, is a feeling curbed by turning a corner and finding that, oh, you didn't really discover anything. There's someone already here. The depth of discovery, the peace of isolation, is an emotion I always struggle to put into words. But it's simply the realization that the pure adventure of pushing the envelope, pushing farther and farther into the void, makes the most empty, desolate world feel full.